Hello GES111 students, and welcome to our fourth in our series of lectures on globalization, lecture 17, and I am speaking to you from Germany, where I have gone on an author's workshop, so it's very much a practice of globalization and distanciation, which is what we're going to talk about today, that brings us together in this virtual format. So today we're going to talk about the metaphors of globalization. And the metaphors are the ways that we talk about globalization. It's a way of providing an alternative way of framing globalization. This image that I took back in 2012 in Chicago, USA, to me sort of speaks of the ways that we see the world differently, the way that it's shaped, the way that time and space get actually bent and fractured in strange ways during globalization. This is actually a piece of art called Cloudgate, also known more popularly as the Bean in Chicago. And it distorts the view of the city. It's a large metallic object which, when you stand in front of it, gives the city a very strange shape. It brings some spaces close together and stretches some further apart. And that's essentially what's happening under globalization. We're getting a strange sense of time and space around the world. So what we're really talking about here is how we live in a globalized world today. And there are some popular metaphors that we use in globalization. And what all these metaphors do is they describe our levels of connectedness and how those levels of connectedness affect our experience of the world around us. And there are two main metaphors we're talking about. But first of all, let's talk about this word metaphor. It may be a word that you're aware of, or maybe not. It's actually about representation or symbolism. It's a word we use to symbolize something else, a different relationship. So we use a metaphor as another way of talking about or representing a relationship. And so these two popular metaphors are as follows. Firstly, the global village, and secondly, the shrinking world. These are two very popular metaphors that you'll hear time and time again when it comes to globalization. So we'll talk about those and unpack those in this lecture. Related to that are a couple of other concepts. One which is called time-space convergence or compression, and another which is about social contact and time-space. Like I say, we'll talk about those more in the following lecture. First of all, let's talk about this first popular metaphor of globalization, the global village. The metaphor of the global village was actually a phrase which was first coined by Marshall McLuhan. He's a media theorist. He's Canadian. And he was interested in the shared social spaces that were created by television. In the 1960s, television was having a big impact in North America. Of course, television hadn't come to South Africa yet by this time. We only received television in 1976, long before all of you were born. But what McLuhan realized is that television as a shared social space was altering our understanding of the world. And he used this term global village to describe the way that the world was more connected through television. It's an important metaphor because we can extend it to technologies today as well. So the way that we interact through television, as McLuhan discussed, but also increasingly cellular phones, mobile phones, the way that the whole world gets connected, and not just the rich world, but actually, as we've talked about, the global south as well. Because it's in continents like Africa where mobile technology has really taken off the most. So the African continent is quite connected, both with itself and with places outside of this continent. So this idea of the global village, we can see how technology allows us to become and feel much more connected than ever before. So it's a pretty clever metaphor, actually. But why? Why is this metaphor so appropriate? Well, let's think back at our image of community. If you remember, this image here at the top on the right-hand side was an image of a village. And it was used to depict the idea of community as proximity, living close to someone else. That was, remember, the idea of community, living next to someone. And a village was a good example of that. But now let's extend that to the global scale. How can we say then that we're still proximate, that we're still intimate, and that we communicate directly and quickly as one does in a village? Well, that's through technology. So television, the internet, social media allows us to feel like we are proximate, we are very close, we're intimate, and we can share information, news very, very quickly. So how does this global village idea extend to the larger world? Well, as I said, social media, television, the internet, celebrity culture. Information spreads very, very fast around the world. And those technologies increasingly link us together. We get to see news unfolding as it happens. We learn about world events, about culture, music, film. We actually feel like we can connect to people on the other side of the world easier than ever before. So that's the global village. The other popular metaphor is that of the shrinking world. Now this is a curious one as well, because we have to ask ourselves, is the world really shrinking? Of course not. The world's not shrinking. It's really about how our perception of the world is shrinking. How places that are actually far away from us, in terms of actual distance, seem much closer. And usually this is, again, through technologies. It's about how we experience the world in a very different way than ever before. So this graphic, which is a slightly different one than the one you've just seen before, tells us about the actual time that it would have taken someone in these various eras of the world to travel. So the text is very small to see, obviously, but in the top image we see the world, and we see the average speed of a horse-drawn coach and ships in the time between the 1500s and the mid-1800s. And that average speed was about 10 miles per hour. Quite slow. Talking about probably less than 20 kilometers per hour, something like that. Then we go to the 1850s to the 1930s. And what do we get but the invention of the steam locomotive, the train, powered by steam, with an average speed of 65 miles per hour, with ships about half that. To the 1950s, when aircraft, propeller-driven aircraft, speed the world up to 300 to 400 miles per hour, and the 1960s, and the advent of the jet aircraft, where speeds now exceed 500 to 700 miles per hour. So you can see the world is shrinking in the sense that we're able to span long distances. So we call these space shrinking technologies. They lower the constraints of physical distance on our movement and communication, and they accelerate the movement of people and ideas and information over space. So effectively, it brings places closer together. The example that I just gave was aircraft, and we can see in the example of aircraft how these technological changes have happened very quickly. So as the world is really not literally shrinking, it's experienced that way because faraway places are becoming closer, essentially. So the example of aircraft is a good one. If we look at all these aircraft, they share one thing in common. Firstly, they're all built by the Boeing Corporation, and they were all developed in the 20th century. So the top aircraft is from the 1930s, and it was a mail aircraft, a post aircraft. They carried post, and they were able to carry 2 passengers inside the belly of the aircraft. Not a very comfortable flight. The next aircraft is a Boeing Stratocruiser, much faster than the aircraft above, and in this case carrying almost 100 passengers. To the Boeing 707, which was the dawn of the jet age. This was one of the first jet aircraft that really became in global production and use, carrying almost 200 passengers with speeds up to 700 miles per hour. And then finally the jumbo jet, the 747. This is what really revolutionized air travel in the 1960s and 70s, carrying up to 300 to 400 passengers and able to span huge distances around the world, essentially any 2 points in the world nonstop. So within the span of the 20th century, we see a huge technological leap which allowed us to experience the world in a very different way. But it's not just these kind of extraordinary technologies, it's the everyday things that we experience here in South Africa as well. Television. So distant places, cultures, ideas are brought right into our living rooms through television. And what it does is it really makes the unknown or unfamiliar more familiar. It enables us to feel like we've traveled to places, or we get to know people and culture and ideas that are different from our own, all without leaving the comfort of your lounge in your house. So the world is essentially shrinking, and it's through transportation. As I've said, we see these changes happening through ships, whereas it took ships 55 days in the mid-1600s. Steamships allowed that to be shortened to a week, and then aircraft even shorter, transatlantic flights even shorter than that, to 7 hours in today's jet airliners. So to go back to that original image, we can actually see that the world is shrinking over time. And the fact that I'm speaking to you now from a very far away place is also testament to this idea. Because just last week Friday, that's where I was. I was in my department. I was in my office. The next day, I boarded an aircraft like this. A few hours later, I was here. That's Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And a few hours after that, I arrived in Germany. And I'm speaking to you now from another country, another place, through the use of technology, the internet. So it brings us to these last two related concepts. The first one being time-space convergence, or otherwise known as time-space compression. So time and space actually begin to converge or come together in globalization. As we've said, the world is shrinking in some ways. So the image you see on the left is a conventional map projection of, in this case, the Pacific Ocean. If we were to apply this idea of time-space compression we could actually visualize how places have become closer together through globalization. So these are very different looking maps because what they demonstrate is how close 2 points in North America or South America actually are, or 2 points in North America and Asia or Australia actually are. Not how physically close they are, but how relatively close they are through the compression or convergence of time and space through globalization and technology. So in my case, Germany and South Africa have become closer together through the technology of aircraft, which I used to get myself here, but even closer through the internet, where I'm speaking to you right now. The second related idea is about social contact and time-space. I've used this image before to depict how communicative technologies, the internet, has allowed us to communicate easier than ever before. But it speaks to the idea of social contact. So, social contact often is on the body scale or the local scale. It's where we're face to face. We're talking to each other in front of each other. We're speaking to our neighbor across the gate. That's a body scale or local scale type of contact. But we also must speak about distantiated contact. So contact at a distance, over space, over long reaches of space. That could be through Facebook, through the telephone, the email, social media. This is an important element of globalization because every day we're communicating with people with whom we're not physically proximate. We're not next to them. I'm not sitting next to you in this lecture as I normally would be. I'm sitting thousands of miles away. So the idea of social contact being changed under globalization is an important one as well. So to summarize the key ideas here, there are a number of popular metaphors that we have learned about under globalization. One, the global village, and the second being the shrinking world. And what both do is they describe how connected we are and how this connectedness has affected our experience of the world. Under globalization, the world isn't literally shrinking in reality. So the area, the spaces, in terms of their actual size, are not changing or shrinking, but our experience of them is. And it's usually through technology where this happens. We call space shrinking technologies. And what they do is they lower the constraints that physical distance actually has on our communications and our experience, and they accelerate any number of things: people, ideas, goods, objects, information. Related to those two main metaphors were the ideas of time-space convergence or compression, and the idea that social contact is actually changed through this experience. But to close, it's important also to summarize the fact that in spite of this increasing connectedness, globalization can still reinforce spatial inequalities at all levels, all scales, the local to the global. And that's an important consideration, particularly given a focus we've had in this module on spatial inequality, which seems to be rearing its ugly head at every stage. So those are the big ideas I'm going to leave you with for today. But before I close, just a few announcements. This week, you should have read the additional readings on globalization found on ICANFA, and you should have completed Prac 7 on globalization. Next week, after the long Easter weekend, which I hope you enjoy, we will start a section on tourism. So we'll actually enter into the last section of this module, Part 4, which will be on tourism and sustainability. So there's a reading for weeks 11 and 12 actually on tourism. That's also available on ICANFA. Some important notes about next week's lectures. So Monday, of course, is a public holiday. It's Family Day. So we do not have a lecture on that day, but there will not be an electronic lecture. So there's no lecture at all on Monday, but we will have lecture 18 next week, Thursday, 1 week from today. And then Prac 8. So your final Prac of this module. So congratulations for getting this far. Finally, we're at Prac 8, and that Prac will focus on tourism geographies. Now it's important to note that because of Monday's public holiday, for next week, only the Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday groups will do Prac 8, and the following Monday, that is Monday the 29th of April, the Monday group will do Prac 8. And that will conclude our Pracs for this module. So I wish you all well for the Easter long weekend. Be safe, enjoy, and I look forward to seeing you when we all return from the long weekend.